Okay, we've got Little Rock, Arkansas, the Bronx, Tucson, Arizona, Falls Church, Virginia, Miami, San Ramon, Minneapolis, Jenkintown. I did start the Facebook Live. Can you see it running? Twin Cities, Freetown, Massachusetts, Kansas City, Missouri, Freetown, Massachusetts, Brooklyn, Collegeville, Pennsylvania, Woodbury, St. Paul. Hello. Glad to see everybody. We're thrilled you joined. Manhattan, Dublin, Ireland. Now that's far away. Thank you. Chicago, New York, Niskayuna, New York. Okay. Now let us know what your favorite Bronte and or Jane Austen books are, please. Well, what I'm seeing is exactly what we'd expect. Pride and Prejudice, Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, Northanger Abbey, Jane Eyre, Jane Eyre. Isn't it amazing? Pride and Prejudice, Wuthering Heights. And oh, someone said Emma. Emma's my favorite. Emma again, Jane Eyre and Emma. Great. Great Persuasion, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Also an excellent book, Sense and Sensibility, Agnes Grey. Great. All right. All right, shall we get started? Yeah. You ready to do that? Hi. All right, we're going to get started. Nice to see you all. I will unmute myself. Hi, we're going to get started. I'd like to introduce the authors to you. First sitting, you probably see her with the curly hair, and Bronte's mistress behind her. And we have a lot of them here at the store also. Fionnuala Austen. And Fionnuala joins us via England and Northern Ireland, and now lives in Brooklyn. And she has quite a history. She was a reader from day one and drove her sister crazy, making up stories and telling tales, much like the Brontes did when they were young, because this is what you get. This is how you get authors, and this is how you get people that have creative minds. And she went to university from Merton College, Oxford, in classics and English, which makes a lot of sense. And then her master's is in English literature, 1800 to 1914, which obviously a tremendous love of literature and a major focus on the Victorians. Now, you run a blog, correct, called The Secret Victorianist, which I'm certainly going to get started reading because it sounds exciting. And also, it's interesting, during the day, focus is on social media. I believe you work for Facebook, or that's one of your customers. And so there's a tremendous amount of focus on social media. And as you probably know, folks, we're not as good at it as she is. So, but we're trying. And then we have our second author here, Natalie Jenner. Natalie.
Hi.
Hi. So Natalie was born in England also and moved to Canada when she was young. And her bachelor's is from St. Michael's at the University of Toronto. And she won the 1990 I guess she was a gold medalist in English literature. So we have a very strong literary talent here. She also is the owner of a bookstore, and that's near and dear to our hearts. And we had a little chat with her about that yesterday and talking about what it's like to try to do that on your own or in a small store. It's a lot of challenges. And right now, she lives with her family, and she has rescue dogs, which we all applaud. We're big dog people in this and big rescue dog people. And we're glad she's here, and she brought us the Jane Austen Society. So we're looking forward to to listening to both of you chat, and I'm going to pull myself out of the conversation now. Thanks so much to you both for joining us.
Thanks for having us. I know we're both really excited to be here.
Do you want me to say something? I'm feeling bad. I feel like it's like I'm thrilled to be here too. And can you hear me okay, Fionnuala? You can?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Great. Yeah, well, I think maybe we should kick off by saying how we met each other. So I absolutely loved your book, Jane Austen Society. It goes without saying. And what I love about it is that it's reading and books, and particularly the books of Jane Austen, that bring your group of characters together. And of course, we're all connected from all around the country and the world via Zoom tonight to talk about books. And you and I met because we had books coming out this year. So you wanted to tell everyone about that?
Yeah, because we're part of a special 2020 debuts group, and every year they pass the torch forward, and we are both being obviously published this year. And I was published at the end of May, and you were published, I think, is it a week and a half ago now? It's like last Tuesday, right?
Last Tuesday. So yeah.
Yeah, but we've been on the journey together for a while. We've been talking and emailing and messaging each other for a while now, and we have we met at Christmas time and exchanged our advanced reading copies, and both were early readers of each other's books, and that was really wonderful to, as a huge Bronte fan as well as an Austen fan, it was just really, I found a very inspiring historical fiction debut from you, and I just ate it up. I just loved what you did with Lydia's character, and I was thrilled when you asked me if I wanted to duke it out with you over Austen versus Bronte.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting because we've been talking about it as a showdown and duking it out. But as you say, you love Bronte, and I love Jane Austen as well. And Bronte's plural, I should say. I do feel like I've got a bit of an unfair advantage having against one. But I know there are some real Jane Austen super fans out there. So I don't know if you want to share like your first reactions to Jane Austen, the Brontes, which you came across first, and whether you've been firmly in Camp Austen.
Well, I've definitely discovered Austen first because I think she's my mother's favorite. So I found Pride and Prejudice in a box on the shelf. I actually have it somewhere behind me, but I was very young. I was 9 or 10, but I discovered Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte pretty quickly after. I think I was around 12. So my entire life there, probably Pride and Prejudice, Emma, Persuasion, and Jane Eyre, and to an extent Villette, are books that I would reread regularly and have just always been a huge part of my life. I have to be in a certain mood to read any of them. It's very much, I think it's more mood based for me, but I definitely, if you ask me what my top sort of 5 books are, I would say Pride and Prejudice and Jane Eyre are both in my top 5. So that's me. How about you? How are you? Are you firmly Camp Brontes?
Well, I mean, my name is Austen, right? For something. Though it's funny because when I lived in the UK, I always had to specify Austen with an I. And when I started to do that, when I moved to the US, the reaction I got was, of course, like Austin, Texas, whatever Austin is there. So there's that. I similarly started reading all of them pretty young. I think probably Jane Eyre was the first Bronte or Austen novel, and it was read to me by my mother, who's on the line super late from Northern Ireland, so hi. But I think my first interaction with Jane Austen may have been on screen versus the book. So I certainly remember seeing the 1995 adaptation, Pride and Prejudice, pretty early. And so it was the stories that were my first exposure to Jane, when really appreciating the writing came a little bit later. But by my teens, I was reading all of them. And I think it's so interesting what you say about moods, because I've been asked, which is your favorite Bronte sister and which is your favorite Bronte novel, so many times in the last week and a half. And I feel like my answer changes depending on the time of day and how I'm feeling and, you know, what my mood's at that moment.
Yeah. Yeah, like when I'm feeling very aggressive and spiky, I say Mansfield Park. I say, to heck with you all. I'm going to be the outlier, you know. And I brought something to show you, actually, before we go any further, that this was a present for me when I turned 50 from my husband. It's huge. It is from Edition de Saint-Père in France, but it is, in 3 volumes, the original handwritten manuscript that Charlotte submitted to George Smith in 1847, and it's a limited edition. So I was going to pull out really quickly to show you that you literally get, like, there's page 1 of her manuscript.
Oh my goodness! Wow.
Yeah, isn't that great? So behind me for tonight, I have on display all of my Bronte, not all of them, but many of my Bronte books, including some beautiful hardcovers as well from the 1940s. So very much a huge fan. So very excited tonight to talk about why they're all so great.
Yeah. But I think there's always been that idea that they're in conflict too, right? Well, one, I get this people mix them up sometimes. I don't know if it's Jane Eyre, Jane Austen, the two Janes, or is it just because they're so kind of famous in the literary world? I read somewhere earlier today when prepping for this that at the Bronte Parsonage Museum, is this where Pride and Prejudice was written, is one of the top questions they received. Why do you think there's this confusion?
Oh, I really do think a lot of it is the name Jane. I know that sounds trite, but I know it's a bit of a slip when people say it. But I do think also that, unfortunately, you know, that marketing, well, you're marketing, right? You know, that marketing concept of if you have more than one.
Natalie, you just slipped onto mute.
Unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
I can indeed.
Okay, great. That concept of the pie being, you know, made bigger by the more players involved. And what I feel kind of happened historically with women writers in particular, and we'll probably talk about this a bit more in detail, is the pie got kind of sliced in half. It's like you either like this or you like that. And I think that's done for a lot of reasons. And I think often it does come down to what popular culture can withstand. I heard someone famous recently say, like with movie stars, for example, there can only be a handful of really kind of top people at any minute in movies. You know, that's about as much as the, you know, consumer can handle, right? So I do think that there has been sort of this intentional conflation, maybe by the canon a little bit, and who's making decisions about that, which historically has been more men in academia. But I also think that there is that sense of trying to kind of in shorthand contain things and sort of have a handle on it and making assumptions. That's always been my gut feel, as people just they make assumptions about them as writers too. Oh, they're more gothic, they're more romantic, and she's, you know, she's like happy endings, and so never the twain shall meet. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think that I came across this idea recently about a culture of scarcity or abundance. And I think for women, because historically it has been harder to be taken seriously as a writer, there is this feeling of there's less space at the top, which makes it more likely for women writers to be pitted against each other. Whereas we feel like and this plays out in the corporate world as well, right? If you feel like there's only space for one woman on the board, you may end up being pretty ruthless towards other women. And I think what's amazing about now is that there's so many people who are celebrating all the great women writers. And gonna quick plug, I was on the latest episode from Bonnets at Dawn today. That whole podcast started out as Austen and Brontes, but is now expanded to be about celebrating lesser known women writers of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries as well. And I think there's such a moment of rediscovery, not just of the Brontes and Austen, but a lot of other women who maybe should have been part of the canon.
So it's a win-win, right, at this point. I mean, I love that I love that I can have these conversations with people from all over the world now about just literature in general, especially from your time period that you studied, like 1800 to 1914, which is probably also my favorite time period as well. And I do think that there's also this interest in good storytelling. And that was something that was so predominant at the rise of the novel. And I want to talk about, you know, with Bronte's Mistress, your debut novel, and having studied, you know, these great works. What you always want to be a writer? Like, what was your inspiration for this particular story, I guess?
Yeah, and then I'm going to throw that one right back at you about Jane Austen Society too. But yes, I always wanted to be a writer. But I think, like a lot of young writers, I didn't really have anything particular to say for a long while. So in my teens, I was always writing stories, but never finishing them. I do think my creative writing took a hit during my academic studies. I think part of that was just you only got so many words in you. If you're writing 6,000 words a week of essays, it can be really hard to have any juice left for creativity. On the other side, though, I think I had a slight imposter syndrome, or because I was studying so many of the greats, I thought I'll never be as good as that, so what's even the point of trying? However, throughout my 20s, I started to get more serious. Bronte's Mistress was the second novel I wrote, though it's my debut. It's the first one that got published. And by the time I started writing it, I was pretty serious about writing as something I wanted to do professionally, not just as a hobby or for fun. But I didn't set out looking for the story. It wasn't like I was like, I want to write my Bronte book and found my angle. I was actually reading Elizabeth Gaskell's biography of Charlotte Bronte. And I love Elizabeth Gaskell too. If there's any Gaskell fans in the chat, let us know. I think North and South is wonderful and great to compare to Pride and Prejudice in particular, but I've read her other novels too. And in this biography, I just came across her depiction of Lydia Robinson, this older woman who Branwell Bronte was rumored to have had an affair with. And she calls her wretched and profligate. She says she tempted Branwell into the deep disgrace of deadly crime. And there's such a clear sexual double standard here of blaming the woman for the affair, even though she doesn't have access to divorce. She has no property rights. She really is in a highly dependent position. So I don't think we can judge her as we would maybe people who commit adultery right now. And so that was the catalyst. That's what set me off on this journey. But that was a wonderful moment, right, of inspiration, the moment that you dream about as a writer where you're struck by an idea, but it was built on a long foundation of reading the Brontes and digesting their works and thinking about them a lot. And for me, the longer burn inspiration for this is Charlotte Bronte's judgment of other women that can come through in a lot of her works. I think we see hostility towards women who are better looking, wealthier, maybe deemed more superficial. And I was very interested in the idea of, are the Brontes held up as sort of ideal feminists because they reject so many social trappings? And that, of course, feeds directly into some of Charlotte's depictions of and criticisms of Jane Austen, which I know we're going to get to. But what about you? Jane Austen Society, was there a moment?
There was definitely a light bulb moment. Actually, I think I saw Edward Petit on tonight, and he was actually like kind of like in the room when I got the inspiration, even though I only met him this one time, but I was in Philadelphia. There he is. I was in Philadelphia for the JASNA East Pennsylvania region meeting, and it was on persuasion, and I decided for my 50th, 50 was a big year. I was getting books and trips. I decided to take my daughter down to Philadelphia to attend these amazing lectures. And in the lead up to that, what had happened was that we had, I'd been a lawyer. I had spent my 20s building up a career in M&A and corporate securities law at a big law firm. So again, did not leave much time for creativity and creative writing. And then I left the practice of law. The first thing I said is, okay, Chickie, write that book you've always, talked about doing. And I wrote 5 books in my 30s. I met a total wall of silence. There's absolutely no interest from anybody in the world. And I just kept plugging away. And then in my late 40s, after a 10-year break from trying to get published, I decided I wanted books to be a big part of my life, a bigger part of my life. And I decided to open a small independent bookshop. And unfortunately, 4 months in, my husband got really bad health news that he was showing the beginning of this genetic form of lung disease that has killed, several people in his family. And we weren't told we had necessarily very much time. So we had to make a lot of quick decisions about time. And we shut down the bookstore. We took some bucket list trips as a family. We're young. Our daughter was only 14. And I read the heck out of Jane Austen. So I spent a year doing what turned out to be unintentional research, the culmination of which was the trip to Philadelphia, because by the time I got to Philly, I was so besotted with Jane Austen and relating to her in a way that I'd reread her my entire life, but this time round, I was getting something deeper from her and more solace. I needed more solace, and I was finding it, and I was becoming intellectually curious as to why I was able to find solace from Jane Austen. And I also took a trip in the fall of 2017 to Chawton for a week just to pay homage to her. I went to her grave. It was the 200th anniversary of the passing of Jane Austen. And I spent a week in Chawton, and I got to go inside Chawton House for the first time. And everything I saw on that trip kind of got into my writer DNA. So then I come home from Philly, theme is being grief, and I look around and I realize that I was in anticipatory grief myself over the fact that I had been told I would not have the future with my husband that you hope you're going to have, that you will grow old together. And it was a form of grief. It was not easily identifiable to me that that was what I'd been struggling with. And this conference in Philadelphia not only helped me kind of come to terms with that, but it made me very interested in issues such as connecting over books, finding comfort from books, preserving history, the people that continue to research, and you would know this from doing your master's, right? The people that keep alive and find new information and help us peel away the layers of the geniuses in our past, which is such important work. And finally, having had the bookshop, I was thinking about historical fiction, which we both write, and how wonderful it is to go back in the past and kind of learn things about history, but also about yourself in a kind of a safe way. You know, it's just enough distance for me, especially with what I was going through. And apparently a few days after the conference, I just looked around in my family with my light bulb moment and said, you know what, I want to write again, and I'm going to write a book about a group of people that come together to save Jane Austen's house. And there they are, right on the cover. And there's our little house, you know? So like literally that's what I said I was going to do. And that is it. And so I had a real direct line from the inspiration to the book. Yeah. That's my story.
There's so much in what you just said I think is so interesting. I mean, one, your characters find that solace in Jane Austen as well. And those were some of my favorite passages of the book, where they're debating different Jane Austen novels and sharing their thoughts and really connecting over literature in a deep way. And just seeing how many people are so active in the real Jane Austen society, especially here in North America. Like the Jasna community is amazing, and thankfully has not been anti-Bronte as well. So thank you for that. That really stands out to me. The other thing that stood out was that both of us have written novels before. It's not like the first thing we wrote got published. And that, of course, makes me think back to the Brontes. And for me, that's always made them very relatable, that they did have this juvenilia, that when the three Bronte sisters did decide to self-publish essentially their poetry, it was a total flop, barely sold any copies. And then, of course, for Charlotte, The Professor was actually the first novel she wrote, and she had to face that rejection and pick herself up and write Jane Eyre, which remains probably the most popular Bronte novel. So that's something I've always found really identifiable with the Brontes. Do you identify with Jane Austen's career in any way?
Very much so. It's really interesting you say that, because I hadn't really processed when I was younger that she essentially did self-publish in a way, right? Like she purchased copyrights. She, you know, was very involved, I think, with the sale of Susan, which was, you know, Northanger Abbey. I mean, she had to like, you know, buy it back basically. But she was doing things with publishers that, you know, if you and I had to do today, we'd be kind of like, oh, I don't have to buy back. Like, they're not publishing my book. I got to buy it back from them. Like, you know, like she was really, you know, she was in the trenches of an industry 200 years ago. So I think when I was learning about her life, I was drawing inspiration and hope from the fact that she too had gone through these sort of similar kind of publishing quagmires, you know? And I think also when I was writing, the thing that really stayed with me this time around with this book was that I felt very close to her as an author, but also as a woman, because, you know, she left us tragically at age 41, and she had lived, I think, much longer with chronic ill health than we would like to think. And I think she had lived with uncertainty and homelessness, and my identification with her extended beyond the writing career and included the fact that for about 9 years, from I think 1801 to 1809, 8 years, she went radio silent essentially, except for starting the Watsons. And that was the time where her and her parents and her sister were looking for lodgings. And then, you know, her father passes away. They're essentially dependent on the brothers. So what was most fascinating for me, Fanula, was like looking back and saying, you know what? I don't think it's just that she got a house. Like everyone's like, oh, she got a house in China and then she wrote. And she, you know, she literally wrote everyone. Like in what, 7 years, like 1811 to 1817, we get the revisions and publications, The Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and then, you know, the other three books. And that's an incredible track record. But I don't think it's just that she got a house. I think it's that I think she found a certain ability to coexist with the trauma and the ill health she was going through, as well as maintain hope. Mm. And I think that came from finally being settled. And when my husband was put on experimental drug protocols in the fall of 2017, I don't think it's a coincidence that exactly 4 to 6 months later, I felt for the first time in 10 years, this creative impulse to write. And I was coming from having even just the smallest bit of hope. And that's the other theme in my book was, you know, that sometimes you're not given much. And sometimes all you feel like you have is hope, but it can be just enough to keep you going.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's so interesting, right? Because so many people depict writing as such a romantic pursuit. And I think we have movies to thank for this or blame. There's the montage, right? There's the light bulb moment, which does happen. We both had that happen to us. Yeah. But then you see the writers sit down, whether it's in front of their laptop or their typewriter or with pen and paper in hand. And then we just speed up the writing process. And it's super romantic. But one thing, again, I love about what you're saying about Jane Austen and then what I know about the Brontes is the business realities of writing and the very human realities of the situations you find yourself in. So I love that the Bronte sisters decided that this was what they were going to do. They were going to write their novels, send them out, try to get money. It was obviously a really difficult time for them as a family as well, partly because of Branwell and the affair that my novel Bronte Sisters is all about. I don't think that makes it any worse. In fact, I've always been very excited by the practicalities of writing and the women who made their living this way in a time when they didn't have very many options. Another 19th century writer I very much admire is Mary Elizabeth Braden, who wrote something like 80 novels. Some are better than others, but she did it because she had a family to feed. She had multiple children. She had stepchildren as well. And there's stories of her writing as she was going into labor. And if that's not gritty, I don't know.
No, it's very important because I think a lot of what has been left room for at the top, the Virginia Woolfs and the Catherine Ann Porters and the George Eliots, you know, Catherine Mansfield, like women that did not necessarily have children. And not always, but sometimes had means financially, you know, which also would help, right? So what for me is so admirable about both the Brontes and the Austen, even though we're going to knock them against each other throughout this hour, but what was very inspirational for me was that they really could have copped out. Like they could have just, you know, gotten married and stopped trying. But what comes through when you really do a deep dive study in Austen, as I did and as you did with, you know, the Brontes, what really comes through is how proud they were of their talent, their work ethic, and their ambition for their talent, which I know this time around. I don't know that I'd really appreciated it, but as I saw the resilience in Austen and her approach to her craft and how much she loved her characters and how much she shared what she was doing, which I don't because I'm wildly superstitious when I write with my drafts, but she really loved feedback. You know, she'd like keep track of like, you know, our neighbors and friends' little reviews and letters. Like, you know, she would kind of hold on to stuff. Like she really, really was, I think, quite in a wonderful way, very proud. And I suspect Charlotte especially was very much similar.
Yeah. I was thinking when you were talking about sharing, right? Okay, not sharing your work in progress, but nowadays we have to share so much of ourselves as writers, which was absolutely opposite for Austen and the Brontes. Jane Austen being referred to as a lady. And the Brontes taking on their pseudonyms as the Bell brothers. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that. I mean, I've been thinking a little bit about how the Brontes' gender ambiguity has kind of continued throughout their legacies. So they chose these names that I think are wonderfully gender neutral by our modern standards. They're definitely not picking super male names. When you think of Curra and Ellis and Acton, they're great gender neutral baby names for me. But because of that, so much of the press speculation was, are they men? Are they husband and wife teams? Is it really one man? Could a woman have written this? Through the 20th century, we see that kind of speculation, especially around Wuthering Heights, right? Could Branwell have written this because of Emily? Because no woman could possibly have written a book this good. That's something I actually poke fun of in Bronte's Mistress, where I have Branwell stealing from Emily, not the other way around. I think the fact that Jane was always known as a lady has kind of affected how people have seen this as just romance, happy endings, whereas the Brontes have maybe been taken a little bit more seriously, even when that's involved thinking that Branwell wrote their books.
What's really interesting about when I'm listening to you thinking about that and I'm responding to it, but at the same time, what's interesting is that a lot of what makes the Brontes so powerful is that the romantic notion of expressing the self, right? Free expression, let it all hang out, react to nature, react to love, just go for it, right? Which is very different from Austen in the world that, she's depicting. And, we could argue that historically that, keeps muting me. Maybe she does not like what I am saying. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, good. That free reign, of like expression and molding art to kind of fit your emotional world. We could argue that socially, people would be more apt to describe that as a more female, response. And I think one of the great things the male romantic poets, sort of did for us was sort of like liberate that notion. And I think the Brontes are kind of inheritors of that. I think, Jane Austen, like what, Romanticism period, what, like 1780s, to 1840-ish, 30s. Jane Austen was writing alongside that period, but she was not immersed in it because she had also grown up with the satire and the irony of the 1700s, right? So whereas the Brontes, I think, were full inheritors of that tradition. And I think they really threw themselves into it. And I think in a very strange way, that breaking down of barriers and systemic barriers, but also as an artist, sort of just going for it and not feeling contained. I don't even know if I see it as gender, but I see it as free and modern and edgy and authentic. And I feel like with Jane Austen as an artist, she will always be somewhat contained by the fact that she wanted authenticity. She wanted people to always go after what was best for them, what they knew is best for them. But she didn't want to blow the world up. She wanted to have the individual still manage to function within society. Yeah. Whereas with the Brontes, Fionnuala, correct me if I'm wrong, it's much more subversive, I think. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that could be true. I think it's interesting whether this idea of functioning in society, is this something that the Brontes are actively rebelling against, or is it just something they had less experience of, right? They were brought up in this pretty sheltered way. And I think we're starting to understand that they weren't entirely sheltered, right? There has been a lot of mythologization. I can't even say that.
Mythologizing.
That'll do. Mythologizing of the Bronte story. And I particularly enjoyed Sharon Wright's recent biography of the Brontes' mother, Maria, which really situated them in a social circle and talked about the people surrounding them. Even though their mother died early, there was a network around them. So they certainly weren't kind of orphans on the edge of a moor, right? Like they had a father, they had people around them. But at the same time, they were pretty sheltered. And I think we see moments in several of the books where you see a sheltered character enter the world for the first time and be almost unable to navigate it. So whether that freedom is natural and innate or a romantic affectation, I think is a question.
Yeah.
I also think that we are talking about three Brontes, and I'm very cognizant that we've been kind of lumping them together.
Yeah.
And while certainly subversive in the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, Agnes Grey is very top of mind for me right now. Obviously, it covers potentially the same period as my book, depending on how biographically we read Agnes Grey and the second family, the Murrays, where she goes and lives. But in that book, Agnes is not a Jane Eyre. She's not voicing her passions. She is actually incredibly reticent. She has to keep her feelings inside. She has to stand back and be mute while the man that she loves is being toyed with by her student. She's a governess, Rosalie. And it was interesting because rereading Agnes Grey, I was actually reminded of Jane Austen and in particular Persuasion, and this idea of having to keep face when actually you have all this turmoil inside. And I think that's why Persuasion is one of my favorite Jane Austen novels, is because there is a depth of emotion. And part of that comes because of the longevity of the attachment. We're not seeing someone in the first flushes of love. We're seeing somebody who has regrets and has lived and has a real depth of feeling. And I saw Agnes as very similar to Anne Elliot in that respect.
It's funny because, you were talking about her character and the similarity with Anne Elliot, and then also maybe Fanny Price to an extent. I do think with Austen, there is a very strong stoic kind of tenor. And I think with Charlotte Bronte, in particular with Jane Eyre, there's this sort of strong moral line that can kind of run in tandem with that. And, you know, if I think about what Jane Austen would think of Charlotte Bronte, for example, I think she would respond to Jane Eyre as a character making decisions based, you know, whether it was with St. John to not enter into a loveless marriage and for further social good, or not marrying, entering into a bigamy relationship. Sorry, spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't read Jane Eyre.
We're not going to spoil our own books, but I feel
we can give away the end of Jane Eyre. But I think Jane Austen would have really appreciated that about Jane Eyre. I think Wuthering Heights would have scared the bejesus out of Jane Austen. I think she would have had to go to her couch for a day and just be what was that, you know? So I do think that with the different sisters, you know, I do think that Anne Bronte is being rediscovered to an extent, right? Because they are very different from each other. And these are our four very different writers. In the end, for me, the universality, the common theme that I love about all four of these authors is that sense of the power, or at least the attempt by the individual to go after what they want, and that affirmation of the self, you know, which is really present, you know, in all those stories, except some people have to do it in a way that's much more repressed and contained. You know, even if you look at Sense and Sensibility, you have Marianne and Eleanor doing it in two very different ways, right? Yes. And I think these are fascinating themes for all human beings, is how to live a good, productive life, how to live a happy life.
Yeah. So that's what Jane might have thought of Charlotte if they'd been reversed. But I did want to just briefly read what Charlotte said about Jane. I wanted to pull it up so I didn't get this wrong. So she said, and this is having just read Pride and Prejudice, which I think is important context. This is the first Austen books that she ever read, and it was on recommendation that it would improve her own writing, which had been described as pretty melodramatic. And she says, I had not seen Pride and Prejudice till I read that sentence of yours, and then I got the book and studied it. And what did I find? An accurate, daguerreotyped portrait of a commonplace face, a carefully fenced, highly cultivated garden with neat borders and delicate flowers, but no glance of a bright, vivid physiognomy, no open country, no fresh air, no blue hill, no bonny beck. I should hardly like to live with her ladies and gentlemen in their elegant but confined houses. And I thought it was so interesting when you said stoicism, because something I've been thinking about is in this battle that we have between Austen and the Brontes, is this a battle over Englishness and Britishness? And two very different conceptions of it. So the Brontes are half Irish, they're half Cornish. They live in the north. The landscape is rugged, though it is true that the landscape around Fort Green Hall, where my character lived and my book is set, was not the rugged moor. It's much more of a cultivated Yorkshire landscape. And whereas Jane Austen, I think, more home counties and trips to London and southern prudence and etiquette and not expressing what you really feel and sitting over tea. And I'm speaking really broad strokes here and kind of deliberately playing into stereotypes a little bit. But that's something I've been wondering. And with that, maybe a greater class variance coming into the Brontes' works. I think we see more attention to characters of a lower social class. And that's often tied very much to the setting's northernness and the fact that Yorkshire is so central to the Bronte sisters' works.
You know, it's funny because I do think that their environments, their physical environments, like literally what the terrain was like outside their houses really did impact their writing. And when you talk about the concept of Britishness or Englishness and what that could mean for them all as writers, I do think that Jane Austen was coming at this at a time of war, you know, prolonged war with France and Napoleonic, you know, battles, and all her many of her brothers were, you know, involved in the Navy. She had 6 brothers, 5 of them married, some of them more than once, unfortunately, losing wives in childbirth. And I think what happened with Jane Austen as a writer and her concept of what Britishness is was that sense of that we're all in this together. You know, that community, that we need each other. Miss Bates needs Mr. Woodhouse to invite her over for backgammon and food, and needs Emma to bring over a basket. And that's in a comical, or not pathetic, like sad pathetic, but a feeling way of how people can help each other and help lift each other. And I think with that sort of more Yorkshire, northern, more exposed environment sort of to the elements, but also not being close to a major city like London, and not having active, huge extended family. You just take Jane Austen and the siblings and all the children, you're looking at dozens and dozens of people, and close to a major city and theater and travel to each other, and the Brontes traveled, they were often traveling for work. I mean, they were going, to Europe to teach. There would be two of them together. They wouldn't know anybody in town, show up in Brussels, So it's fascinating to me how these environments that they were in.
Oh, it's only turned on for you.
Sorry, can you hear me still?
I've done
Yeah, I think to mute.
Okay, I think we just have to someone's, as long as you can hear me, I'm good. But I do think that those different environments really affected their sense of what they were trying to achieve with their work. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was another moment in Agnes Grey that actually really stood out to me. And one that felt very biographical is when Agnes talks about the landscape around where the Murrays live and how flat it is, and how uninteresting compared to the environment she grew up in, which here I'm choosing to read biographically and say is the environment around Haworth. And I also went on a research trip. For me, it was after writing the novel, but I went from the area of Great and Little Euston, where Thorpe Green Hall was, where Lydia lived, to Haworth. And there was a huge contrast in the areas they lived, from the kind of chocolate box perfect village surrounded by flat landscape, to, Haworth's pretty industrial. It's on the edge of this moor. Obviously the graveyard is super impactful. Any of you who've been there will know, it's overflowing with tragedy as well. So I very much saw that as, home, and something that was important to the Brontes, but has very much affected their imaginations. Something I came across recently, which I thought was really interesting, was this idea that Jane Austen has maybe got a little bit Bronte-fied in adaptations. And I'm particularly thinking about the Keira Knightley Pride and Prejudice, where there are more shots of the landscape, there's more rain, it ups the Gothic, and maybe we're seeing the Brontes and Austen being collapsed in on each other in adaptations. So taking dance scenes, which everyone loves in Jane Austen, and throwing a few of those into Bronte novel adaptations, taking the landscape and the passion bursting forth in time with the pathetic fallacy of the rain that you might get in a Bronte novel.
Oh, I think it's very intentional, because I think those are the parts of the books that not only most translate well to film, but that will capture the biggest audience. And I think that, my daughter's rereading Persuasion right now. She's home from university, home being conceptual. She'll be going online soon, but she's rereading Persuasion, and she's reading this whole section. It's like a travelogue for a description of Lyme Regis. It goes on for 2 paragraphs. She's like, Jane Austen never describes anything. What is she doing here? Jane. She's like, Jane, you don't have to sell me on Lyme Regis. I've been, it's beautiful, And it's funny though, because there isn't that descriptive, prose in Jane Austen that you get with, especially Charlotte and Emily, I think. And, going back to the criticism that Charlotte lobbed against Jane Austen, I actually think it just comes down to a difference in what you want your prose to look like. I really do. I don't think it's conceptual. I think it's about poetry. And I think it's about, a lot of lawyers love Jane Austen. I'm a former lawyer, and I would say right now I have 1 to 2 lawyers reaching out to me because they've read my book and responding to it. And I'm like, what's with all the lawyers, right? But I realize there's a strong history of lawyers being some of her biggest fans. And I was at another event, and I was mentioning in Professor Juliet Wells' book, Reading Austen in America, she talks about a family that was trying to go visit Admiral Francis Austen, who had lived to his 90s. And they're going to go over there. They write him a letter. They're like, we want to come meet you. You're Jane Austen's brother, earliest fans. They're doing what I did, 3 years ago. And they said, we were introduced to the joys of Austen by the late Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States and his associate, Justice Story. And I think there's something about Jane Austen's prose that does respond to the lawyer mind. And I truly mean this, because what she's doing is the same as poetry, but without description. She's treating each word, each syllable, each beginning consonant, its placement at the beginning or the end of the sentence. She's treating each of that with as much import as the idea at play. And that's what poets do. But she's doing it through logic and reasoning and using language to convey as much as possible with as little as possible. She's actually very efficient in her prose. And I think that that's that containment, or that elegantly, manicured sort of, fenced in garden that Charlotte is criticizing. I think that's what Charlotte's really responding to, because she and Emily especially have this very, well, and Anne too, this very strong poetic kind of bent. What do you think about that notion?
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. I think there's an idea that I talk about a little bit in my book about, well, how can you know if you really meant what you said? Or what if I'm only saying something in order to get a reaction? And I think that passion is often reactive. It's of the moment, it bursts out of us before we can see it prudent. And I guess the harshest critique of Jane Austen is, where's the passion, right? Like, or maybe that there's some sort of, I was thinking about this earlier, I don't know if I fully agree with this, but we would all like to be Jane Austen characters, having a witty repartee like Elizabeth Bennet, being able to hold it together. But in reality, I think most people are a bit more rough around the edges and a bit more like a Bronte character, where they give into these flights of fancy and they do let passion burst out of them. And in the case of Branwell, I occasionally play that in a little bit of a comic way, where he writes effusive letters to Lydia claiming to love her, which includes portions of his actual poetry, which Branwell wrote a lot of. I think it's pretty bad. But at the end of the letter, he'll ask her, P.S., please send me more money. And so, like, I think as a person who's sometimes being called dramatic, you do have to kind of come up against that in yourself. Like, how much am I really able to control? Or why, when it matters, can I contain myself? And is there such a thing as a poetic outburst? Or is this all just to get a response out of people and to provoke a reaction? And Lydia in my novel takes this to the extreme. She's being neglected by her husband. He's not sleeping with her. And there's a moment where she finally goads him enough that he actually is pretty violent towards her and grabs her by the throat. And her feeling is, I hope it leaves a bruise because that'll prove that he loves me. And she just wants to get any response out of him and provoke any response in another human being. And that, unfortunately, is much closer to the way I see people move through the world than how I see Austen characters. Never do such a thing.
That's so funny because now the gloves are off, Vanilla, because I actually think, and my characters in my book reflect this, I actually think that most people are coming at a lot of life from a position of trauma and damage and are holding in a lot of what they feel. Certainly we have our outbursts. And if you look at Austen's books, there are people doing no end of, bad, sexual behavior and infidelity and making, decisions based on passion. But I also think that what I was trying to get at with my book, with these characters in particular, was coming through the Second World War and having trauma behind you. And it's that sense of just not sort of just hesitating about risking pain again and putting yourself out there. So a lot of what Austen's characters for me are doing is there's a lot going on under the surface, but on the surface they're following all the rules of social decorum. They've got the A to Z guidebook out on how to behave, but there's a lot more going on. And I mean, this actually leads me to the concept of whether there's like a sort of like a Bronte personality for a reader. Yes. And an Austen personality. So I may have given mine away, but let's start with you. Do you think that there's sort of a personality for a Bronte reader versus an Austen?
I don't know about a reader, but I do think that that's there with character identification. I think it's not a coincidence that a lot of people discover Wuthering Heights and love it in their teenage years, because it is such an angsty book. It's full of anger. It's also filled with a lot of anger towards the older generations, right? If you go into the next half and see how the sins of the fathers and mothers in this case are really visited on the children. So I think often it can be about life stage as well. But I think it's pretty mood based. And yeah, I will say I do think there's a little bit of wish fulfillment in a lot of people's readings of Jane Austen, maybe especially people who love them for the plot versus for some of the deeper things that you're talking about around the language and what's going on beneath the surface. There are people who love Jane Austen because of the costuming and the adaptations and the romance, and I think that's totally fine. But could most people come back with a comeback like Lizzie Bennet? No, but they think they could, and they like to think they could. Obviously, not everyone is going to have the sort of romantic, poetic thoughts of Jane Eyre or be able to express them as easily either. But I just find it a little bit more relatable. The fact that Bronte's characters, I think, are very flawed. And I'll go back to Agnes Grey again because it's top of mind. I don't think that Agnes is entirely Anne. I think that Anne has moments where, I don't know, she has some humor at Agnes's expense. Like, Agnes doesn't know how to move through the world. And when she turns up as an employee and expects to be greeted like a guest, I think that we're laughing at her in a little bit of a way, and we're seeing her flaws and her weakness. And she reminds me of a lot of 21-year-olds, 22-year-olds I've seen enter the workplace and be really surprised that they have to earn their dues and work very hard. So that's why I lean towards seeing a world more full of Bronte characters, but I could definitely be convinced.
So, I mean, it is so fascinating. I do think one of the things that's going on with the Brontes that Jane Austen does not do is I do think that although their writing is not autobiographical, they are immersed often, when we talk about literary technique, they are often immersed in that first person voice. You know, one of the reasons I love Villette, which is just such, if people here have not read Villette, like, it's mind-blowingly good. And it has an unreliable first person narrative voice in Lucy Snow, right? You don't always get told everything that's going on. It's very inventive that way. But what's going on, I think, with you know, each of Emily, Anne, and Charlotte is maybe the plot is not autobiographical or reflective of the world that they were living in, but the emotions seem very real. And I think they do an excellent job of conveying the emotions. And I think Jane Austen does an excellent job of conveying the real sort of social dynamics at play, or what you need to do in order to kind of get ahead. You know, I think when you say aspirational, like, on the one hand, you can argue aspirational is happy endings and, you know, oh, I want to be as witty as, you know, Elizabeth Bennet. But also, I think at the beginning of my book, I have a character, a farmer, who has just finally decided he lives in the town where Jane Austen, you know, spent the last decade of her life. And he's like, okay, I'll go take Pride and Prejudice out of the library. And he's reading it, and he's really trying, I think, through her character's choices to figure out how he himself will get a happy life. Mm-hmm. And I don't know when I'm reading the Austens if I get that instruction. So you're right, it's very mood-based. Sometimes when I write, I want the thrill of the Brontes give you the thrills, right? Where, like, you're just almost shaking, because how can I read Jane Eyre so many times and know there's this, you know, mad woman in the attic and kind of still and know what he's about to do and kind of be like, oh, you know what, don't show up, don't wreck the wedding. Like, it really gets under your skin, you know? And I think that that's the emotive or the emotional landscape of their books is so powerful and so strong. And I do think that over time, fandoms have kind of caught up to that. And generationally, I think there's a response to that more living on the edge of your emotions, which is very real. It's just not always a world that I necessarily, you know, want to go into, or a world where I'll learn sort of for myself, kind of like how to find happiness. But it's very real. And I think the other thing that's very real about all their books is systemic or social barriers. You know, you're talking at the beginning about Charlotte and the level of envy and antipathy in her books towards the women who've got it all figured out. The Lydia Robinsons, the ones who, you know, they've got the husband, the wealth, the kids, and they don't have as much of a fear of having to, you know, they don't have to provide for themselves. They have other fears. But, you know, I think that that's very much what's at the heart of a lot of the plots of all of these women's books is about women not having agency, being contained into an existence, and finding a way to break free of that, whether it's saying no to Reverend Mr. Collins when, you know, a Charlotte Lucas says yes to him in Pride and Prejudice. But Elizabeth very bravely says, no, I'm not having any of that. I'm going to sit here and I end up a spinster. I don't care. I'll end up poor, but I'm not marrying that, you know? And I just find that fascinating. And I think all of these women were exploring that concept, just like in very different ways.
Yeah, there's a moment in my book where Lydia reports a conversation that she says she had with her husband pretty early, where he says that her capacity for joy almost scares him because it will have to be matched by unhappiness. And this idea, if you go to the extremity of emotion on one end, you're going to hit it on the other. And I wonder if we've been talking about personality and mood. I almost wonder if this is a life philosophy as well. I was given a piece of advice once in a work context about riding the middle and just blunting your emotions on both ends and just riding down the middle and being very controlled. And it's so interesting to hear you talk about lawyers, because I think there must be an amazing capacity for being controlled with lawyers, because they always give you the textbook answer. And they'll never tell you, you're like, well, what do you think's likely? And they'll always be like, well, these are the possible outcomes. And I think it must be take an amazing amount of self-control to be always riding that middle line. And I don't know, maybe that's what I respond to the Brontes, is that they're willing to put it all out there and go for it and have the good and the bad. I do agree, though, that there's not a very strong didactic strain in that this is how you live a happy life. I do think there's a didactic strain in this is how you live a moral life. Certainly in Anne, and at times with Charlotte as well, much less so in Wuthering Heights. But that's a kind of through line, is do the right thing, but that's not always going to be the most socially beneficial. I don't know if we want to... Sorry.
No. I was just going to ask you actually about when you were writing your book. When I was writing my book, I have 8 main characters essentially, and they are sometimes self-harming. They're making decisions. They're violating professional kind of obligations because they are so sort of damaged and traumatized by past loss, you know, and they're blocking themselves, like they're not allowing grief to kind of pass through them and to live alongside it. They're sheltering because of their grief. And I was wondering, like for me, my characters felt very real, and I let them drive the plot. Like you had a real life story that yours was sort of based on. So you had an arc, whereas I purposely made up everything. Everybody in my book and every event is completely imagined because I wanted to be able to loosely follow my characters wherever they went. And that meant that sometimes they were holding things back from me. They would surprise me. It was just part of the fun of not plotting. That was my intention with the book, was to keep it so free and loose and unpinned to real facts so that I could follow my characters wherever they needed to go, and that we would all maybe learn things together, and that I would learn things about myself while I was writing. And you were coming at your book as historical fiction from a very different angle.
Yeah, so I think we kind of did the reverse. So I was writing about real people, not just Lydia Robinson and Branwell Bronte and Anne. Every single person in my novel was real. The servants, the dog. I made up one horse's name. I didn't have a name of the horse. But otherwise, yes, you're right. All the people existed. With the arc, though, I still had to choose which years to write about. So I had to kind of create an arc and say, well, if my focus is Lydia, where does it make sense for us to join her and where to leave her? Because I could have started this book with Lydia as a child, or on Anne Bronte's arrival, or on Lydia's first marriage. I could have ended it with her death or with her suing Mrs. Gaskell. These were all things I threw around. But in the end, I did that 5-year period from 1843, when Branwell arrives at the house, to 1848, which is a really pivotal year, as many of you know, in the lives of the Brontes, with the deaths of Branwell and Emily, with Anne soon afterwards. So on the other hand, though, I didn't look back at the novels of the Brontes when I started to write. So I reread them in preparation when I was doing the research phase, but especially Agnes Grey, because there is that overlap. I didn't want to be corrupted or end up just parroting word for word scenes in Agnes Grey. And so I really allowed it to filter through my memory, because my idea was, if Anne was reporting a conversation with Lydia, she would probably remember it differently than Lydia would. And so it made sense for me just to see which bits of that were floating around in my psyche. And I think there's a moment in Agnes Grey where she talks about Mrs. Murray tells her that she doesn't watch the children with a mother's watchful care. and there's a very similar scene in mine, but I wasn't consciously thinking about Agnes Grey when writing that. It had just stuck with me because it was so good and so true. Whereas your characters talk about Jane Austen novels in such depth, I wonder if they were your primary text, just as the history was my primary text.
No, actually, it's really funny. I did the exact same thing as you, which is really interesting. So I read everything not knowing I was going to write a book.
Yeah.
And then I stopped reading probably around, January. And then I never went back. And so when I did finally start to write this book, I was also reading some Henry James. And I was reading, oh gosh, there was just like, I kind of moved on a little bit, because like you do get into a rabbit hole. You do start to exhaust a lot of what you can find. When I did start to write, I just kept the research like whispering in my ear a little bit, like on the back. And I just wrote, and I never looked backwards. And I didn't know that I was going to create intentional parallels with some of the storylines from Jane Austen. The characters sort of told me that through the way they were interacting with each other. I would pick on a vibe between two characters, and I would be like, oh, there's an age difference, socially inappropriate for them to get together. That could be, like Emma Knightley. I could have fun with that. But I tried very hard in writing my book because I wanted my book for me was more about books connecting us and comforting us. So I tried very hard to leave the historical research, the secondary reading, and Jane Austen's own books probably in the previous year and as far behind me as possible so that my characters would have conversations with each other about the works, but their own beings were totally sui generis. They were completely themselves. They were fresh. And that was what made it fun for me was I wanted to be in a new world. I wanted to be in a world that wasn't my own. And I wanted to create stories I did not have any idea what was going to happen. So it's funny that, yeah.
So funny that there's similarities. I'm keeping an eye on the chat because I think we're just going to start to get some questions through. And there is another question about research, about what libraries, documents, sources. So I won't go on about this too much because my research was super intense and I want to keep this conversational. I do have an event with the Historical Novel Society in New York on August 25th where we're going to talk about research the entire time. So if you want all the nitty gritty, Shelley, that's where to find it. But essentially, I used digitized census records. I used this amazing diary of a local carpenter called George Whitehead, who kept 4 diaries of births, deaths, marriages, and sundries in the area of Great and Little Ousbourne in Yorkshire. Bronte scholars have looked at it, but they just kind of looked and saw, oh, no references to the Brontes, what a shame, and have quoted extensively the few references to the Robinson family. But what I did was take the names of all the servants, look at them in the index in the back, and really discover the servants' lives. Biographies and journal articles, I went back to the primary sources. I did a lot of, digging back through that. And then I did this research trip where I actually went to the Bronte Parsonage Museum and did archival work there. So there are 18 letters that Lydia wrote. There's an inventory of all the furniture in the house. So if you hear a piece of furniture being mentioned in Fort Green Hall, it probably is real. It's from that list. If a book is mentioned as being in the house, it's because I know it was there. So as I say, I will have a bigger event that's just entirely research focused. I don't want to pull us too off course. But it was extremely extensive. And yeah, I did a full year of research before writing. So I relied on spreadsheets, which I absolutely had to look back on, unlike what you're saying, Natalie. And I actually had individual character documents, so I could go to every single character, even on the peripheries, and see, well, when were they born? When did they get married? What were the key dates in their lives, to make sure I was tracking on everything.
Sorry.
Go on.
Well, I was going to say is what I was doing was exploring, Jane Austen, not in her own time period, but people in the middle of the 20th century trying to save this landmark that was so important to literary history. So I was reading a lot of books, doing a lot of secondary reading on Jane Austen's fandom over the years, the history of the collection, the curating, who had, reading Austen America that I mentioned earlier, it was about who had bought the first editions in America, in Philadelphia, from a publisher in Philadelphia, of Emma in, I think, January of 1816, and then tracing the lineage. And then what happened for me is my imagination sprung off of the fact that I would see that historically a male lawyer had acquired it, somebody made a literary pilgrimage, somebody bought you know, a lock of hair of Jane Austen's at auction. Somebody made a donation to the museum. And I kind of let all those facts that I was absorbing from these different books about Austen fandom, essentially, and the history of the ownership of her works and possessions. And I kind of threw them into my brain like a Molinex and used the behavior and imputed it to my characters in modern times. Like I even put into my book an homage to the fact that Kelly Clarkson, the American Idol singer, is a huge Janeite and had acquired at auction in 2013 from Sotheby's for about 120,000 pounds, the turquoise ring that is mentioned in my book as an artifact. And that was, I think, a bit of a kind of like a bit of an impulse for me to have a Hollywood actress as a character, because I was thinking about who would have had the means to travel and make literary pilgrimages as women, who would have had the means to collect these artifacts. And then I think finally for me, a lot of the reading, the secondary reading I was doing was about preservation and the impulse to preserve. And the epigraph to my book is from E.M. Forster. And it is, who shall inherit England? The business people who run her or the people who understand her? Which was just this really resonant idea for me, which is the real Jane Austen society when it started 80 years ago in May of 1940 were regular village people. They weren't heads of heritage. They weren't, you know, heads of studies at a university. And they saw something in their midst and they decided they were the group that got together and said, we have to find money. And guess what? They couldn't find money because the war was on, you know. And then a local gentleman, Thomas Edward Carpenter, who was grieving over the loss of his son, he is so grief-stricken, and he buys the cottage outright for about 3,000 pounds, donates it to the nation, and the trust is set up, and they, in conjunction with the society, are able to open this amazing museum that we all go to, just like the Bronte Parsonage Museum. And they opened it, I think, 70 years ago last summer. And that was another thing that came to me, was that idea of somebody doing something productive with their grief, that someone like me, years later, in her own kind of state of grief and worry for her husband, can go see that and learn even more about Austen and be inspired, you know? So it's funny how we were using different types of resources for different reasons. Because our books, essentially, we should finish on, they're very different from each other. So.
So while we're on the subject of epigraphs, I think you can tell we read a lot of 19th century literature because we both thought about them so much. That was yours, and mine. My dedication was to the women who didn't write their novels. And that was really the impetus for me, is it's wonderful that the Brontes and Jane Austen did, but what about the legions of women who didn't write about their lives because they didn't believe that it mattered or that anybody would care? And I think we, in historical fiction, really often think about the women who were the exceptions, the women who fought for the vote, the women who rejected the constraints put on them. But what about all the people who just got on with it? And you're talking about ordinary people setting up the society. I was also, in a way, interested in ordinary people or people with extraordinary talents that weren't recognized just because they were a woman. And of course, there were plenty of other disenfranchised groups as well, but women are really the focus of the book. I'm keeping an eye on the chat, and I can see a question from Amy about whether we're continuing to work on Austen and the Brontes or moving on to something else. I'm going to throw it to you first.
Okay, so I am still in the historical fiction world. I have moved ahead. I am now in 1950s. I'm still in England. I'm in London. There's going to be an announcement in a few weeks, and I can't really say too much, but I will say that it's set in a bookshop, and I'm really excited about it. So it's very different. There's some connective tissue with the first book that I got published, but I'm in the middle of it. I'm researching it and writing it every morning in my little shed from 5 to 7, so I'm very tired. So
that is the most adorable thing. So obviously you should be following both me and Natalie. But on Instagram, you'll see that Natalie has the wonderful little shed tour, and I'm super jealous. I mean, I'm in a 1-bedroom apartment. I don't even have a backyard, and your shed is just absolutely beautiful. So for me, I'm also sticking with historical fiction, but mixing it up a little bit. I've actually gone back in time, and I'm not in England, so I can't say too much yet, but it's been really fun doing research in another language some of the time, not just in English. So that's been challenging. But the connective tissue for me is, again, it's a real woman. It's someone who's been overlooked. But this time it's someone who was an artist and a creative in her own right, and I think deserves more attention, versus someone who was connected to a literary family All right, we got another question from Lily. Favorite writers' books other than Austen and Bronte? So I can start. With
Yeah.
the 19th century, I mentioned Mary Elizabeth Braden, also Wilkie Collins. I'm a big Victorian sensation fiction fan. And then on the more depressing end, which maybe you see some elements of that coming through in Bronte's Mistress, I love Thomas Hardy. I really do, for the bleak outlook. And again, the descriptive language, the importance of the environment. Out of the 19th century, my very favorite book of all time is actually 20th century. It's by Elizabeth Smart, not the one who was kidnapped. It's called By Grand Central Station. I sat down and wept. And this is a real point of connection again between Natalie and me. Is we discovered that we both love this book. Elizabeth Smart was Canadian, so Natalie probably has more claim to her, but I'll keep claiming her for as long as I can.
And it's funny because, I mean, I love Thomas Hardy, absolutely one of my favorites. For me, you know, when you leave the Austen and the Brontes, I say George Eliot. And then I get into a serious Henry James, E.M. Forster, Edith Wharton, Virginia Woolf, D.H. Lawrence. What happens for me as a reader is an attraction, I think, to psychology and the social self versus the inner self. Which is probably why I'm a little schizoid and love, you know, like the Brontes and the Austen almost equally. But I really do, so for modern writers, there's often that sense of examining the social self in relation to others and what we're hiding from each other. So I do love Ian McEwan, Kazuo Ishiguro, I love Susan Minot, Eleanor Lippman, just there's Elizabeth Strout, a bunch of writers who are just very good at hitting that sort of nuanced, sort of like the secret part of our sort of lives. You know, I find that's sort of what I respond to as a reader.
Yeah, we've got another question about how the pandemic has affected us professionally as writers. You want to go first?
Oh, you know, because my husband has lung disease and is high risk, we've been in lockdown for 5 months today. I think we've taken like 2 walks, you know, and what the pandemic has meant, ironically for me, is this very bizarre silver lining of being able to virtually do events like this and stay connected. I mean, I'm doing an event at least every other day right now, and I just get to meet people from all over the world. I spoke to the Jane Austen Society of India this week, and, you know, it's incredible. I mean, I would never have had that opportunity without the pandemic, which is, you know, awful, you know, thing. But at the same time, I'm trying to stay positive about it has had this, you know, opportunity for me to support independent bookshops all over North America, which is also very, you know, near and dear, you know, to my heart. My book released at the end of May, and I think things were starting to bookstores weren't open necessarily, but I think people were starting to get a handle on how to keep selling and providing. I think I would encourage everybody to look at the debuts from March and April, because I think they got really affected in a way that I will not lay claim to.
Yeah, I will echo that. If you want to just discover other amazing debuts, look up 2020 debuts on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. There's a group of around 200 of us, and there were certainly people who had books come out right in April when things were chaotic. Bookstores hadn't got Zoom operating yet, and it's always an adventure every time, but I think we all muddled through together, so go and check them out. For me, similar silver linings. My family is in the UK, so it's been nice. They've still been able to join these events, albeit super late there. I think my mom's just about hanging on. I'm very grateful. But at the same time, it's not exactly the launch that you imagine, right? Like, I was looking forward to seeing people and signing books, and all of that has become much more challenging. From a writing perspective, I have gone into the hyper productivity mode. So I have written more. I know that's not been everyone's experience. I'm very cognizant of people who have small children at home. It's been especially challenging, or people who are homeschooling. For me, it has allowed me to kind of super focus. And that was especially true on the next book that I'm working on. It really gave me that moment of clarity and focus. But that's great if you know it's for a week or two or a month or two. It's obviously very different if it's stretching out to infinity. I can see a question here that I love about if you had to choose a pen name, what would it be? And I actually have an answer for this ready to go. So my name is Fanula Austen. And I've always jokingly said that if I was going to write like erotica on the side or something, it would be Fiona Aston. And I kind of have a persona for her in my head. She's a bored housewife type. And yeah, she writes 50 Shades of Grey style stuff.
I think for me it would always be the names that I want to give my daughter that I wasn't allowed to. So I love the name Finn, Finn. I don't know why for a girl. And I do love the name Ellis. I thought of Ellis actually for a daughter, and as one of my girlfriends. So I suspect I would pick something that was pretty gender neutral and something that was pretty kind of spiky, like short and concise. So
yeah, love that. Okay, let's see if we got any more questions. Oh, how did our families feel about us wanting to be writers and about the chosen subject matter particularly?
Oh, it's funny. My dad's in Oxford. You were at Merton College? My dad's a St. Peter's, and he's a mathematician, actuary type. My brother's an actuary, and we're strong on math. So I think for my family, when I was young, I wanted to be a writer from before the time I could read. Like I think when you fall in love with books, if you're going to be a writer, you often light up then. And I wanted to be a writer my whole life, so 50 years now, because I'm 52. But I knew that I should have a fallback or a backup plan. So I, in the 1980s, told my family that I would pursue a career in law, which would enable me, very smart here, to study whatever I wanted in undergrad, which is read my Henry James all day, do my film studies minor. So I had a great time in undergrad, did well, and then got to go to law school. And so my family was very supportive because as long as I did my best, I think I'm still here. As long as I did my best and as long as I was giving it my all, then I'm sure you're the same way. My parents were just like, you're going to be fine because you're bright and you're ambitious and you're not like you are a hard worker. And I think all those things. What about you?
Yeah. Kathy, if you could go on mute, that would be great. Yes, similar. I have always wanted to be a writer. I don't think my family are surprised that I'm a writer. But I've never wanted to be a starving artist. And so I knew I wasn't just going to be like, what? I'm not going to have a career. I'm just going to sit down and write. And I do see synergies between what I do in advertising, which is very research heavy, and then finding insights in order to create work that connects with people and tell stories. And that's essentially exactly what I do in historical fiction. So I do think there's some overlap there. On the Brontes, I don't know what their thoughts are on this particular. Obviously, my mother likes the Brontes, but I think she would lean Team Jane Austen overall. So I'm really intrigued to hear tomorrow at a more decent hour in the UK what she's thought of this conversation and the back and forth that we've had. But yeah, similarly to you, before I could write, I wanted to be a writer, and I actually have seen my first ever school report from even preschool, and it says that Fanula just wants to stay inside writing and playing dress up.
Yeah.
She doesn't want to go outside and run with the other children. And I think that's always been the same way. And I'm very proud that I've hung on to that through the years.
I think I see, is it Angela?
It's Leslie.
Leslie, sorry, yeah.
Don't mind. Angela was here yesterday. What I wanted to say is I think, and I could be wrong, but that question had to do also, what did the authors, Jane Austen and the Brontes, what did their people think about them writing? What was their reaction to the fact that these women were writing? And obviously, I'm sure you have input into that. So I just wanted to clarify.
I know that with Jane Austen, her family were full of writers. Her mother was very good with the written word. She had an older brother who at Oxford had started like a literary magazine. She definitely had lots of nieces, nephews, cousins that would come to her for advice. So I think she was a celebrity rock star in the middle of the Austen family. I think people looked up to her. I think they were thrilled. And I think they knew they had a genius in their midst. I mean, I think one of the things that makes the whole story of Jane Austen very heartwarming for me is that sense that this family knew. They knew she was up there with Shakespeare, and they gave her space and time to write. Cassandra and the mother, they allowed her to have that time, and that's so beautiful to me. The family would love and support someone that much. Fanula.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to butcher it, but there's a wonderful story about the Reverend Bronte and his reaction when he found out what the girls had been doing. And Charlotte, well, they all waited. And when Jane Eyre became such a sensation, she actually brought a few of the reviews, and she made sure she brought a negative one or one that had some criticism as well. And then she told him, like, Barbara, I wrote a book. And he's like, very nice. And she's like, well, it's published. And he was surprised to see it bound and was worried about the expense. But she left him alone with the book and with the reviews. And when he came to the next meal, he said, well, girls, Charlotte's written a book and I think it's pretty good, or some words to that effect. Yeah. So certainly taken by surprise. She was certainly concerned about what his response would be. I think Reverend Bronte was in some ways pretty forward thinking about how educated the daughters were, though he still prioritized Branwell's education, keeping him close with him in order to educate him. And then Branwell, of course, is a whole other thing. In my novel, I have him obsessed with the thought that Charlotte might write a novel before him, very concerned that what if they are the ones who are brilliant, which, you know, is what ended up being true. Of course, Branwell was struggling with his own demons. But I was always very intrigued by the close sibling bonds and about how interconnected they were creatively, especially in childhood. I think a lot of people are very imaginative when they play and tell stories when they're young, but most people lose that. And what's fascinating to me is that the Brontes continued to play make-believe right into their 20s. And that's an amazing relationship that not many of us find.
Yeah.
Super. That's great. Okay. Yeah, I have this fancy
So I think we're at our time. I think we're at 8:30.
So anyway,
myself, we are at 8:30. I want to thank both of you so much. It's delightful, and I'm sure we'll be speaking with you again.
Yes, thank you so much for coming, everybody. And here are the folks one last time. We're so happy so many Bronte and Austen fans turned up to be with us.
And yeah, thank you very much for having me here. I'm so excited for Finola having her debut just last week. It's a wonderful, exciting time, and I was just very thrilled to be able to be a part of, you know, your launch. So thank you very much for asking me as well.
Thank you. Bye now.